All right, well, it's 9:35, so let's go ahead and get started, and hopefully some others will be able to join us as we get going. Thank you, everyone, for being on our Zoom call today. We got a few more trying to come in, I think. What I wanted to go over first today was the kind of process that we have lined out to get all of our committee work done and completed through kind of till we can get to adoption for the June board meeting is our goal. We adopted our last plan in August of 2016, and timing wise and everything, that puts us in this summer. So I think we can get through all of the things that we need to discuss by then and have a draft for the TPC in May and the board in June. So the schedule, we had a lot of people that said that they could make this call. Not all of those people have arrived yet. So what I might do is send out an email, but I didn't know just right off the bat if anyone had any comments on the meeting schedule as proposed. Does 9:30 on Wednesday mornings generally work?
It works for me.
Okay, well, we will just send out an email and maybe get some additional feedback through that. So real briefly, going back to the plan development process, we're going to start by talking about some of the background information, revisiting some of the things we talked about during the visioning meeting, some additional information. Dave's put together a great online tool for kind of looking at some of the characteristics of our region. And then we'll talk about the design standards and a baseline discussion on the funding projections. And then moving forward, we'll look at how to tie all of that into prioritization criteria and recommendations for the plan, looking at what projects we want to include in the plan. That is one of the big components of a long-range transportation plan for an MPO, having a constrained list of projects that we can move forward into the TIPs in future years. And then reviewing everything and developing that draft plan. And so today I was hoping to kind of do a kickoff with the visioning results from our board and technical planning committee workshops that we held earlier this year. As you can see in the word clouds that we developed as we got going at the beginning of that visioning workshop, words like automated, safe, electric, multimodal, efficient. We kind of see that automated, autonomous come up over and over. So that's something that I think we haven't discussed in prior plans, and so we'll probably want to examine a little bit of what that looks like for our region going forward. There's a lot of different levels of autonomous vehicles to consider, but also how can we focus on safety and efficient transportation. So we'll kind of look at how we can incorporate those things as well. Here's kind of a ranking of how all of those came out when combining the two workshops, that autonomous, connected, intelligent. So I definitely think, looking at that smart transportation will be important. And so then when we get into each of the questions, we had kind of the where are we question, what makes the Ozarks great right now? And what came out on top was the flow of traffic on our highways, which I think is a great, statement on how well our traffic really is managed in this area. And that ties into some of these other items that we have a lot of great partnerships and collaboration And then kind of the other things that receive votes: airport growth, well-maintained roads, and the grid layout. So when we look at why we can't get there, what are the challenges facing us? There's still a lot of, maybe a lack of information by the public as to how the process works, driver's education, that sort of thing, just knowledge about kind of the whole civic level of things. We also have infrastructure, waning, even though we complemented the, maintenance of our infrastructure earlier. We still recognize that there's some challenges ahead. And then looking at innovation and inclusiveness. For where are we going, the regional transit system came up first as far as something that, if there were no obstacles, what we'd like to accomplish by 2045. Being proactive in our decision making, so making those hard calls now so we can see those rewards later. Looking at more solutions like diverging diamonds and roundabouts. And then, the rest is kind of looking at growing that population and jobs and our inclusive culture. And so how do we get there? Education, again, comes up as well as analysis and forecasting. So I think there's, a lot that we can do to, kind of put out there what we're doing to move ourselves forward. Increased funding, obviously, is always a challenge, but something that would definitely help us accomplish our goals. And then continue with our collaboration and cost shares, planning ahead. And so that was what the board looked at. And then the technical committee, for where we are, the connectivity in our growing trail system really came out on top, as well as having a lot of alternate routes, engaged communities. Our travel times, again, came up. And then when we look at why we can't get there, the technical committee thought funding, that our development and gaps in connectivity and land use patterns are issues, but funding overwhelmingly came out on top on that one. So where are we going? If there were no obstacles, the technical committee thought that capacity improvements, matching our growth was important. Even brought up the idea of drone deliveries, and I think that speaks back to what the board recognized with, there's going to be a lot of innovation and a lot of changes that we're going to have to be prepared for. That there's a multimodal connection to the rest of the nation, so not just multimodalism in our region, but a different kind of multimodalism across the country. And then on how we get there, funding, again, is important. Looking at traffic impact fees, which would be a local solution, and then gas tax, which would be statewide. And then also, looking at our laws and regulations and how can they protect us for the future. And so those are the results that came out of the visioning meeting. And I didn't know if there was any feedback or comments on how all of those were synthesized. And I want to welcome everyone that made it onto the call, and please feel free to unmute yourselves and have a conversation.
Hey, Natasha, this is Frank Miller. Can you all hear me?
I can hear you, Frank.
Okay. So I was looking at how the word cloud talked about autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and then in the feedback, or excuse me, the results from both meetings about how why can't we get there? Funding comes up in both the board and technical committees feedback. I think the plan kind of needs to talk about or highlight the fact that as you move towards 2045, vehicles will be changing in terms of how they're powered. And so when the typical model for transportation is the gas tax, and really that only funds one of the modes that we deal with, that's going to have to change by 2045 because technology is going to really force that to happen. So I think that's probably something to kind of take from that that input and to try to describe, as I think about the public or even our members reviewing this, that we need to be thinking about the fact that in our plan's horizon, our technology is going to change how we're funded, and we don't know what that's going to look like.
Thanks, Frank. And, something that kind of struck me during, kind of the time when everyone was staying at home earlier this year. For example, I drive an electric car, so I don't pay gas tax, but I do buy a special fuel decal. And, there can be debate about whether that's, enough or how to determine what that fee should be. But at the same time, when I'm not driving, I still paid for that decal. Whereas the gas tax, if you're not driving, that money's not going to anybody. And so I think there's definitely some ways to consider, how we do handle that funding. And I know, MoDOT's looking at their legislative priorities. We just were on a call yesterday, and it was mentioned about how to balance registration fees for the fuel efficiency of the vehicle against what their potential gas tax contributions would be. Instead of doing the taxable horsepower and whatnot for registration fees. And so I know there's a lot of discussion on how to kind of manage that funding going forward. Does anyone else have any comments on the visioning? Okay, well, we'll move right along in the agenda. And so we don't have an item in the actual agenda packet for this, but we do want to talk about our demographics and socioeconomics. And I'm going to let Dave do a presentation on the ArcGIS experience that he put together. And I know we've been through, kind of the basics when we did our visioning workshop. And so I think this will be a great addition to understanding what's going on in our region.
So this is basically an experience builder with ArcGIS Online. So it's kind of a different way to put your content, maps, and such together in their format, in their cloud. So I put one of these together with some stuff that we've already had made and other things to kind of demonstrate some information in another dimension. So first of all, this is just the landing page that should be on your screen here, and it's our base map. So I demoed that a few times, and everybody should be somewhat familiar with it, but this is just that standard map, just kind of welcoming you to the page. Other tabs that I put on here are demographic information. So as soon as this pops up, you should get a 2D view of the OTO and a 3D view. Let's just take, there it is. So the 3D view, it enables you to kind of express a couple different variables visually and everything. And so on the 2D map, you've got the population values, and you can see the legend on the lower left-hand side for that. The red dots are the most populous on that. So these are linked together in their views. So if you scroll in this one map, it should move the other one to the same location. But these columns, the height is actual population relative to population. Sarah's mouse is a little different. So the height of each column is how many people live there, and the color is the median household income. So you can see the darker blue, the higher incomes over 100,000 per household are down kind of on the James River here. So that's kind of a distinct pattern. And then in the central part of Springfield, you've got the lower incomes in that quadrant. And you can also get the information for each city. And right here, there's a way just to click on it, and it should take you to the extent of that, of Republic of Willard, in case you don't want to get your fingers sore from scrolling. But these 3D maps, they work in a desktop. I don't know where the camera is, but a desktop with a mouse. So you usually have to use all 3 buttons on the mouse, the right click to get your, your vertical and pan and zoom in as well. So this is just kind of a way to look at where people live and another kind of aspect about it too. And we did some stuff for thresholds for transportation, rapid transit, feasibility, some density benchmarks. And one of those were housing units per acre. And if you get about 7 housing units per acre, that kind of meets one of these threshold metrics for more frequent bus service, about 15 or 20-minute frequencies. And again, the columns are extruded by a height in the 3D map. So the height is the number of residents and jobs in that column, and that's another threshold metric. And I think it was 17 residents or plus jobs within a column would be able to, meet that threshold to get faster transit. And those are the jobs and residents are the height, and that housing unit density is the darker color. So that just kind of gives you a view of the area. And this is just for the OTO and all the different cities. So it is regional to us. And then you can explore Nixa and Ozark and Republic and the whole area in terms of what's going on here and kind of see the distribution of different things. Non-residential square footage and employment is another one tab here. And this all exists in the cloud, so you're waiting on the cloud. So this is a map of non-residential square footage, which is like another metric that they use. So if there's like 15 million concentrated non-residential square feet, that's the threshold, and that equates to about 75 or 750,000 these square feet. So I had the building footprints from Microsoft building footprints for the area, and then estimated the non-residential square footage using parcel files as information. So you can get another view of our beautiful area, and you can zoom in, and our base map, the vector tiles are under this, so you can see more information. It zooms in just like the base map with everything else. So you can kind of ground truth some stuff. So this is the basic distribution of non-residential square footage, and the height is the number of jobs within that column. So you can see kind of on that national corridor and St. John's, and that's what all that is depicting in the universities and everything else. But then you can also see surrounding areas. Another metric that we have is transportation costs. We pulled this out of their Esri demographics that they use with the Bureau of Labor Statistics to find out how much people are spending on transportation. So this is total household transportation, annual household dollars spent on transportation in the OTO, which is the darker blues are the higher the money spent. And again, you can see the more money you have, especially looking down by the river, that the more money you're going to spend on transportation, and that includes everything. The height is the proportion of money spent on public or other transportation. That's depicted in the 2D map. So this would be, in this other map, the darker, they're paying a higher proportion of their transportation spending dollars on public or other transportation. Other transportation includes taxis, which I assume is Uber and Lyft in this category too, so it's not all transit. And there's other non-motorized modes that you spend money on, like bikes and stuff like that, that are in the other category. And then a couple more tabs on here. I put together a few dashboards a while ago. One of them was for our performance measures. So this is the updated performance measures that you see that we present every year. So you see how we're doing in green is pretty much meeting all our thresholds, and then how far we have to go on our goal for the trail network and sidewalks, and then vehicle miles traveled and different metrics in a bunch of graphics and charts. And I know how much everybody loves these charts. Can't get enough charts. And this is the growth trends dashboard with information from the growth trends report that's been updated and all the housing permits. So this is just a tool that we started using where, you know, we can leverage more of the information that we have to collaborate with everybody, and we can put together some types of, you know, this information online that would help us communicate with everybody in our public involvement goal. So that's what I've been doing. I don't know, this is Sarah's desk, so I don't know what's going on.
Well, thanks, Dave. And does anyone have any questions or want to see something in more detail about any of these different thresholds that we've put up here? All right, well, thanks, Dave. And we'll be revisiting some of these transit thresholds as we get further into some of our conversations when we get to that part of the plan. But I think it's important to note that, you know, we also, that land use side of things supports what happens on the transportation side of things. And so we need to make sure that we're coordinating that from both directions. And so let me go back to sharing the agenda. And so next on the agenda are financial projections. And just briefly, in the prior plan, you know, where we identified our revenue sources, we talked about our, you know, all of our federal sources that are available statewide. And so these are the dollars that MoDOT brings to our region through their process. That includes the National Highway Performance Program, the statewide Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, which is just the statewide portion of our SDBG funding, the Highway Safety Improvement Program, and then there's the Open Container Transfer provision. MoDOT's required to spend a certain amount of funding on safety because we do not have a statewide open container law. And then there's the special programs, various discretionary programs like build and infra. This doesn't come through MoDOT or OTO, but the Recreational Trails Program that's administered by DNR. I know that's funded some various trails in our region. And then we have the sub-allocated funds. And these are the things that we at OTO get to have a conversation about and decide, you know, what improvements get made with these funds. And so that's our SDBG Urban that we currently allocate to each of our communities. And then we have what they call the set aside, or formerly TAP money, and enhancements before that. But that's what we use to fund our trails and sidewalks. And then city utilities receives a direct amount of funding for being an urbanized area. And so that's about $2.7 million a year with that. We also get funding to the area for enhanced mobility of seniors and individuals with disabilities, and we use that to buy buses and vehicles for human service agencies. And then a portion of that also goes to city utilities. And then we have the bus and bus facilities funding, the 5339 funding, and that helps with some capital purchases for city utilities. And so locally, you know, everyone brings something to the table to match all these federal funds, and that includes sales tax, property tax, you know, for city utilities and transit, that's the rate payers. You know, there's also funding through other avenues such as development agreements, improvement districts, and even going to the Missouri Transportation Finance Corporation. And then MoDOT, their state funding, which I guess was the very top bullet, you know, that's the registration fees and state gas tax and those things. And Frank's going to talk in just a moment about how all of that gets distributed, and the projections that the state has put together for what that looks like over the next 10 years or so. But when we do get to figuring out what projects we want to do, we also need to look at all that funding and how much we have or we think we're going to have through 2045. And so we usually break that up into what you call a time band. And the first time band is really going to be what we're already planning for the tip. Those are things that are already in the works, that we already have kind of thought through and scoped and engineered, and we're ready to move forward on those projects. And then we have the next 5 years, and then another 5 years, and then 10 years after that. And so that's how we've generally split up those time bands before. And then just to be a little conservative on our funding, we usually use an inflation rate of 1% on the revenue side and a 3% inflation on the project cost side. And I think that's worked out before. So before we have a lot of discussion on that, I'm going to let Frank kind of jump in and kind of talk about the MoDOT side of funding projections.
Okay. Thinking I might see if I can share some content. I'm looking for a public document, but basically, typically we'll do some funding projections, and by we I mean our financial services division in Jefferson City does some funding projections, and they're doing them basically right now over the fall time frame, and then they'll submit them to our commission in either December or January. And what they're looking at are historical trends based on our revenue and where things have been headed. They do a report every month to see how much of our revenue is coming in based on the motor vehicle sales tax, the fuel tax, and then the license and registration fees. And so we've obviously, with this year, with COVID-19 and the pandemic having a lockdown, we've watched those things pretty closely. So that kind of helps establish the trends for where we're going with things. They look at demographic data to help them gauge things like license and registration fees, because, as people turn 16, they get a driver's license, there's a fee associated with that. As we have in-migration or population trends, if the population's growing, that could mean more registrations in our state as well. It might also lead towards the motor vehicle sales in addition to that. They look at information from the Department of Energy to help them project the potential gas consumption and the prices of gas and how that might impact gas consumption. And they may prepare several scenarios to look at that our commission will consider, and then they'll pick one that becomes sort of that overall amount of money that we'll have coming to us. I was talking and not looking up the document, but it's the, let's see here. Do I have the ability to share content on this?
Down at the bottom, you should be able to go to share screen.
I've got reactions, oh, there it is, the big green one, okay. Okay, so screen one. I'm going to share this part of our website that anybody can get to right now, and it's our Citizens Guide to Transportation Funding in Missouri. And I wanted to just share this because I think we've shared it with OTO before and at the various meetings, but a lot of people don't realize that this is all put out there that has the description of the funding that we have and what comes into us. And so here you've got what I just talked about, our projections on the state revenue side. And so that's 1.5 billion. And then we also have the federal revenue side, which is based on the federal transportation bill. And that's at just under $1 billion. And with the extension of the FAST Act for 1 year, that kind of helps us understand what the direction may be for at least one more year. But that bill, again, the FAST Act will then expire a year from now, approximately. And then Congress will have to decide what happens next in terms of what federal transportation programs will happen and what amount of funding will go to those programs, as well as an allocation formula to the states. But a lot of that's been pretty consistent for the past, gosh, I'd say 20 years now, in terms of how it's distributed. There's just been fluctuations in the amount of funding given towards transportation. You know, at the state level, I talked about we get funding from the motor vehicle fuel tax, which is a gas tax for diesel and regular gas, the license and registration fees, and motor vehicle sales tax. At the federal level is just based on a gas tax, and the amount of money coming into that, both the Highway Trust Fund and the Transit Trust Fund, is not supported based on how much Congress has promised to the states. So they're basically having to transfer in general revenue to kind of make up the gap for that. And so they've essentially agreed to do that for another year. But it's important to understand that there's no federal set aside source of revenue besides a gas tax and diesel tax. And that tax is not covering the need that Congress has defined that they, you know, how they want to fund the states. And then if you also notice on my screen, we have a small yellow wheel here that's basically Missouri general revenue that comes from state general revenue. Most of that goes to multimodal services, including the state pays for the Amtrak service between St. Louis and Kansas City. Missouri contracts with the Amtrak to provide that service. And then there's some other things like ports. We don't have ports in Southwest Missouri, but our river ports elsewhere on the Missouri and Mississippi rivers get funded through the general revenue. And then I want to show you also that some of that money goes directly to the cities and counties, and that's distributed by a formula. For cities, it's based on population, and for counties, I think it's road mileage and assessed evaluation, and maybe population is in there. But every city, every county in the state gets some of this state revenue. We also have to provide some of the funding for the Missouri Highway Patrol, and then the Department of Revenue can cover their cost of collecting the taxes. We have a debt payment that goes for a bridge program we had in, you know, earlier this century, and also our Amendment 3 program, which funded several projects around the area, including our 6065 interchange. So we're paying all that off. And then the bulk of it goes to this $1.5 million, which is what Natasha's talking about. That funding gets distributed around the state. So I want to show you now some of this, how it's distributed around the state. I'm showing you, I think you can all see this. This is a table. I don't know if you can see the numbers or not, but it's important to understand. I'm constantly talking about this, but I'm also finding people don't realize it, that there is actually a set formula for funding to be distributed around the state. And the funding is distributed to the 7 MoDOT districts and the 3 large metropolitan areas. So for the Southwest District, we have an allocation specifically for OTO, and then an allocation for the remainder of the district. And there are multiple funding categories. Let me scroll down here. We have 3 main funding categories: asset management, which is a funding distribution based on an amount that's meant to approximate how much we need to take care of our system. In reality, we need more than what comes through this funding formula to take care of our system. And we do asset management plans to kind of verify that and confirm that. But the asset management funding is distributed based on things like the square footage of bridge deck and the lane miles of roads. And then we have the safety funding, and that is distributed based on the number of crashes in the area. And if you look at this table here, I could probably zoom in and help you out a little bit with this. SWU means Southwest Urban. That is the same as the OTO area. So asset management wise, that formula is largely based on the size of the system for roadways specifically. And that is about 3.2% of the state. Safety, it's 4.2% of the state's funding. So that roughly equates to OTO having about 4.2% of the state's crashes. And then system improvements, that's a formula that then incorporates not just the lane miles, but also the population and the traffic volumes and the employment. So when they say fill out your census because it influences how much money comes to your area, yep, that's exactly what's happening here, that, you know, people filling out their census is going to impact how this formula works in the future. And that is 5.3% of the state. So we do go through, we update these numbers every year as we're putting our construction program together. We ask OTO to help us with the division of the employment in Green and Christian counties between what is OTO and what's outside of OTO, because employment is again a factor in the system improvements funding distribution. So it's important to understand where the money comes from and the fact that the vast majority of the funding does get distributed around the state. A couple exceptions to that. We have our major bridges that are over 1,000 feet. That is funded at a statewide level. We don't have a lot of those in Southwest Missouri. We do have some, don't have very many in OTO at all. In fact, I think the only ones we have left are the flyovers of the major interchanges. But outside of OTO in Southwest Missouri, we do have some over lakes, for example. And then some of the Joplin area also interchanges and over the Spring River. So that program is meant to fund those because while in Southwest Missouri, a major bridge may cost us $10 million, one of our major bridges over the Missouri or Mississippi rivers can be 100 million, 200 million, and they're very expensive, and that would overwhelm a district's particular budget. So we may just statewide. But it's important to understand that that's happening because when we have a big project somewhere in the state, that means that there's less money left over to run through these formulas that I'm showing here on the screen. So we see that impact us, for example, in 2024, funding's a little bit lower for the OTO area because of bigger major bridge projects elsewhere. The other major exception to this is our cost share program, which runs about 40 to 45 million a year. And that funding is statewide funding. Anybody can apply to that program that's a city or a county in the state and wants to pay half the cost of a project that they want to do. And there's no set target on any of that funding going to a particular geographic area. It's partly based on who applies. There is some level of geographic balance in that if funds become really tight, it may be one per district and the district has to prioritize its applications. But we don't usually get there. Usually there's enough funding around to kind of help any good application move forward. So that program is available and it's not impacting the funding coming to your region when you go apply for that. So those are the two exceptions to the funding distribution. And so working on this plan, obviously, as we move into this current funding update, we're watching to kind of understand what the impact of COVID is. We've definitely seen an impact to our gas tax revenues because people are driving less. Conversely, there's been a lot of sales of cars, and that's kind of really helped us out that the impact has not been as great as we thought it might be. It's been a little bit of a surprise. Personally, I suspect that that's going to have a limited benefit because, you know, everybody's not going to keep buying brand new cars and may slow down a little bit eventually. And so then we need to kind of focus on what happens with gas tax revenue from the standpoint of the economic situation, because when we have a recession, what happens is people are unemployed, they're not driving as much. So we do see some sustained impact to vehicle miles traveled, which impacts our gas tax revenues. But they're trying to figure that out right now. It's a little bit of an unprecedented situation, obviously. So we'll see what comes of that. But, you know, this plan goes to 2045. And so, you know, COVID will, you know, it will change things, but it's not going to be that lasting impact for all those years. So we can look at kind of what we have for, we do a 10-year asset management plan that has some projections in it, and I'm going to show you the funding page from this year's plan. And this is based on last year's funding projections. So we did our asset management plan probably with more positive funding projections than we might otherwise expect. Let me move this over to the shared screen. Is there a funding page in this? There it is. So this is some of the the funding assumptions that go into the plan, and so this kind of shows the levels for OTO, what we're guessing we're going to have. So it's running between 25 million, goes down to 22 million in 24, 25. And again, that's related to major bridge work happening around the state, as well as probably some thinking about the funding projections are going to work out. And then it starts to increase a little bit. Part of this is we do start paying off some debt, and our debt payments go down, so that makes more money available to be distributed. And right now this goes up to 2031. So this is probably, like I said, a little bit on the optimistic side, at least for the next few years, but it's probably still pretty good for beyond that. Just with the caveat, like I was saying earlier, as we see more and more alternate fuel vehicles come online, that's going to start impacting our revenues as well. And so that is one thing that we're definitely looking at with our funding projections for the next 5 years. But going all the way down to 2045, that becomes a lot more significant. So it's going to be up to OTO to decide, do we kind of assume we're going to have similar funding levels, even though the way we fund transportation is going to change, or do we need to do something different looking towards the future? So that's basically the overview of the funding situation. Natasha, did I miss anything you want to talk about?
No, I think generally you hit on everything. Kind of the big thing that we've seen is the change of moving those major bridges kind of ahead of the rest of the funding distribution. And so we will feel that impact locally when some of those bridges are ready to be programmed and constructed. And so, but I think, looking forward, we need to decide what approach we want to take to our funding situation. Do we want to have an optimistic outlook, kind of be stable in, how funding has been going forward, or look at that, possibility of reduced funding in the future? And, with that conversation, we've always, it's kind of a balance, because we've always said, oh, we're going to be short funding, and then somehow something always comes through to find other ways for us to have funding for projects in this region. So I think it's important that regardless of what that financial projection scenario is, that we have a list ready to use funding that does come to the area. But does anyone have any questions or want to make a comment about kind of our funding outlook going forward? Sarah, is there anything you want to add that we may have missed?
No, just that. Well, yes, I guess the answer would be yes. Was it, Frank, 24 and 25 where the flexible funds or the funds for system improvement was basically zero?
Yeah, that's correct. But of course, looking at the screen I was just showing earlier, it did not have, Natasha made a good point about other funds coming in, and that's it's a little bit of a roller coaster dealing with transportation funding from that standpoint. So Sarah's right, there's really no system improvement money in those 2 years because of the need for asset management, both locally and statewide, needing all the funds. But at the same time, the governor had a bridge bonding program where we took some bridges that were funded in our construction program, bonded them, and then the bonds are being paid back with general revenue at the state level. And the money that was freed up from that was distributed by the system improvement formula to the various regions. And we were kind of watching that to kind of see where we're going to be at with revenues this year. So we don't know that the amounts we had last year are really what are going to be available this year, but we should have some of that. So some of that will be available for us to look at for doing some projects in the next 3 to 4 years to help compensate for that a little bit. But as Sarah pointed out, those major bridges really are an expense for our state. In some ways, our state is blessed and was founded on those major bridges, but they're really becoming an issue for us in terms of the cost of them. Because when I talked about the 1.6 billion, if you think about like our Rocheport Bridge just costing almost 300 million, that's a really big chunk of our annual money just to address one bridge. In St. Louis and Kansas City are full of these wide, long bridges over the rivers that are expensive to replace. So definitely impacts us across the state when we have to take care of those.
Okay, and so what we're going to do is kind of, watch how those, short-term funding projections come in from MoDOT this next year, and then try to compare that with, kind of what we see happening nationwide, and we'll put together a set of funding projections. But I would like some feedback, and we can talk about this, as we go to put those numbers together later in the planning process. But just how optimistic do we want to be with the funding to our region? And so please just keep that in the back of your mind.
I should point out, obviously, I only talked about road and bridge funding, and some of that extends to bike ped funding. That transit's a whole different thing that I'm sure CU would have a feel working with FTA on what might be available in the future. And then also aviation is a whole other thing as well, that there's some state support, I think, for that and federal support, but it's all based on an aviation fuel tax. Again, I don't really know the ins and outs of all that.
Yeah, and Matt, I don't know if you want to speak to the transit funding outlook, but I know it's been, kind of fairly steady. Some programs have maybe been combined or added in what each region's asked to focus on. But the transit funding nationally is part of the Highway Trust Fund. So a certain part of that gets carved out just for transit. And so I know there's a lot of discussion about, does it pay for itself, or the gas tax is supporting that Highway Trust Fund, which supports the transit fund. But we've not, I guess, Sarah, have you seen a lot in the discussions for reauthorization about really a lot of changes to how transit is funded?
It depends on if it's the House or the Senate. The House has been trying to increase transit funding, as well as looking at, transit funding, additional transit funding in the stimulus, but it's just really too early to say.
Yeah, but I don't think we've seen anything that would, drastically impact the ability for, transit to keep moving forward. And then,
Agreed.
And then on the bike ped side, I know we're going to have a much more in-depth conversation on that. Andy's been working with the with BPAC, our Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, on some various scenarios going forward, and that includes an investment scenario. We we have our investment plan for trails. There's a lot more that goes into our bike ped system than that. But I think we're going to have an opportunity in the future to really dive into what that looks like and how we think we can invest and fund those improvements. So Andy, I don't know if you want to add anything about that now, or we can just have that conversation when we're ready to have that conversation.
I think we may wait on having that conversation. I think we're going to have a bit of a working session at the November TPC meeting. The BPAC will kind of review what has been put together about a week before the TPC meeting, so we'll have some opportunity to respond to the BPAC's comments, and then we'll bring it to the TPC for a good working session during that November meeting. So I think that'll be the best place to talk about it.
All right, thanks. So stay tuned for that. Any other comments on the financial projections? Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to cover this morning is really the progress that we made on our last, I guess the one that we're still under, Transportation Plan 2040, but our current transportation plan. And we really were able to check mark a lot of the things that we had proposed in the plan. A couple of things that we didn't. One was establishing a funding opportunity subcommittee. And this recommendation was to kind of be on the lookout to help develop those applications for build or infra. At the same time, I'll say that as communities have come forward and wanted to explore these opportunities, as a OTO and the board and our members, we've been able to support that application process. And so we just don't have that specific subcommittee developed. Another item was to look at the major thoroughfare plan and the bicycle pedestrian review process, trying to build in a land use into that discussion. And while we didn't quite get through that, we did have some conversations about that, and I think we're going to see some of that continue in the conversations we're going to have regarding the major thoroughfare plan in this upcoming long-range plan. And so then we talked about developing some model ordinances for complete streets, connectivity, and those things. While we don't have the model ordinance per se, we did develop some toolboxes with a lot of available information for the communities. What we found digging into some of these various topics is, there's a lot of kind of nuance and options for communities to look at when putting all of these things together, and how their own code is already written, and where changes are allowed to be made. And so we did make a lot of resources available. And so if you haven't seen those, if you go to our website, we do have a link for those toolboxes, and we have one right now for complete streets and connectivity, and we're working on one for kind of tying into what we do with the major thoroughfare plan. And I think that'll become further developed as we move forward with this planning process as well. And so some of the final things related to transit, and I know there's just been a lot of kind of changes, and then with COVID and everything else, I think there might be an opportunity for some additional discussion and recommendations on how we want to move forward with transit in general. And so, but we did, I want to say we did accomplish a lot of things. We are doing our annual system performance report. We have, initially we were going to do a trail implementation plan for, kind of each segment of trail, and instead we have an entire investment study that provides us with a wealth of information regarding what it takes to build out that trail system. We are including review of kind of the multimodal side of our various TIP projects. And I think OTO has been able to be a resource in numerous ways to our communities, and in development review, and we've developed the transportation impact study kind of model set of review guidelines there. And so, continue to please use us for any of those things if you can. We're also looking at our prioritization process. We've just reviewed that last year for the STIP. We do have our TIM subcommittee. In fact, I think Andy just had a meeting with them yesterday, and for those that aren't familiar with the acronym, it okay, just escaped me. Andy, what's TIM officially stand for? Transportation Incident Management, Traffic Incident Management?
Traffic
Okay.
Incident Management.
Okay, thanks. So then the Southwest Regional Freight Advisory Committee, that's really been something that has been at the lead of MoDOT, but when the freight plans come through this area, we've been active to participate in that. And Andy's participating on a Heartland Freight project right now, and so I think we're active as far as that goes in the area. We do have our Let's Go Smart website, and coordinating that with the Let's Go Smart Transportation Collaborative. And then our jurisdictions have gone through and adopted the major thoroughfare plan. We did add Christian County to the Greene County Destination Plan, and it's now called the Ozarks Regional Destination Plan for bicycle tourism in the area. We do have a hazards environmental assessment, and this is more internal. Dave put this together, and we're able to check our projects against kind of things in the area to be aware of. And then let's see, we've identified our freight corridors as has come through out of the federal request for things with MoDOT. And then we're starting on our next round of planning. So thank you for everyone that's helped put that together. And then I'm hoping everyone, and I know this is probably really small, has looked through, but we went through the list of projects that we proposed in the last long-range plan, and we have truly addressed a large number of things. And where we haven't, I know other priorities have come forward, or we're just not quite ready to get there yet, because that plan obviously did go through 2040. So we're not going to hit every single project in the first 5 years. But it is impressive, the list of things that we were able to complete. And I think there's a lot of pages here to go through, but if there's anything you noticed that we missed, or that you think is important, but please take a look at this, and as we go forward to propose projects for the next round, we'll start with this list, but then we'll also look at new priorities as they have come up. So are there any questions on the plan progress so far? And then we also looked at transit. A number of these things are annual expenses, ongoing projects, but City Utilities has worked on replacing their buses. They've purchased 2 diesel buses, and then there's 2 electric buses on their way. And then also looking at replacing 2 paratransit buses. And there's been some partnership projects with ADA improvements with the City of Springfield, and then doing a kind of a shelter project, and then there's some ITS and other agency support vehicles coming up. So I'd say we've accomplished a lot in the last 5 years. Okay. So the last thing on the agenda for today is what I'm calling the design standards kickoff. And so we have our major thoroughfare plan, and while we say that this looks out 20 years, 25 years into the future, a lot of the things that we actually have on here are probably further out than that. In some ways, this plan, and it all depends on how quickly our region develops, but it can be even looked at as a 50-year plan based on some of the things that we have proposed within it. And so just as a reminder, our major thoroughfare plan shows the desired functional class of these roadways, and then has design standards that would support how we think those roads would function in the future. And so some of this is that we think certain roads that exist now would be upgraded to match that future plan, and then there's also proposed roads going forward. And we've had some discussion about this over the last year or two, and going forward, as staff, we've had a lot of conversation as well, and watching some of the variances that have come across in the different requests for changes and amendments to the major thoroughfare plan. But we want to bring a more flexible approach to how this is applied going forward. In some cases, someone could argue that maybe we've overclassified certain roadways for the time frame of our long-range transportation plan. Conversely, someone could argue that that right-of-way, once it's gone, it's gone, and so it's important to know that in the future we're going to need these improvements. And so we wanted to have a conversation with everyone about what approach do we take to how our design standards are enforced as far as the major thoroughfare plan is concerned. I think it's really important from a right-of-way perspective and from an access perspective, that we keep those things in line, but maybe if a community has a different vision for how they want to, manage the number of lanes versus a bike path versus a bike lane or shared, or all of those things that go into what goes from curb to curb of a right-of-way or beyond curb to curb. I've seen, looking at the comprehensive plans each of our communities have either recently put together or are putting together right now, there's been a lot of discussion about complete streets and maintaining character. and how transportation is important to the character of the community, being multimodal, but then also, you know, designing for the speeds that we want in the roads as opposed to, you know, designing to one standard and then expecting a different result. And so I think Springfield's Ford SGF has mentioned Vision Zero. MoDOT's newly adopted highway safety plan mentions or focuses on Vision Zero. And so I know there's a lot of design elements related to that that can support improved behavior among our drivers. So there's a lot of conversation we can have on what can OTO do to have our design standards support those goals of our communities. So any discussion on that? You know, this is the time to start having those conversations. So at our next meeting, when we do dig in to the nitty-gritty details of all these things, we have some direction to go.
Martin or Kirk from Springfield, can you provide any kind of update on how that context-sensitive design or street typology discussion is going with the city of Springfield? And if you have any thoughts on how that would impact the major thoroughfare plan?
This is Martin. I mean, we're always, you know, with each of our projects, looking at it from a context standpoint. I know we've made changes accordingly to that. You know, we've got some classifications of streets that aren't necessarily, and then the development that has grown up around it doesn't necessarily equate to what you might expect with the classification given.
Martin, do you think the major thoroughfare plan is still a useful tool going forward in the format it is?
I mean, I do think it is, because it's from a planning standpoint. You know, we have to make decisions. In fact, there's been a couple of things that have come up here recently with some inquiries on development that would have an impact. You know what we've seen as far as layouts of our arterials and collectors. That gives us at least a starting point to have those discussions with development and figure out other ways to you know, to accomplish what we need to with the system. So I think having that in place is definitely helpful, and it also is a tool for you know, for others looking at that to kind of get an idea of what future plans are. But I do think, you know, again, it's other things will have an impact, and obviously things causing things to change on the plan, but I do think it's helpful and useful in its current format.
Thank you.
So some of our other communities as well, Jeff, you know, as far as using this in NICSA, are there changes that you think we could make that could support better what NICSA's goals are for transportation?
I really think that what we've got now, as far as NICS is concerned, works fairly well. It aids in our planning, you know, with different subdivisions and different developers as they come in for connectivity and things like that. So, you know, this is something that Travis and I look at quite a bit whenever we're planning something, and you know, as far as I'm concerned, we're fairly satisfied with what we have.
Karen or Garrett, any comments from our public?
Yeah, I think it works pretty well. We need to update like what the City of Republic sees. That's something that we've been looking at doing for a while now. One thing that might help is updating the details you guys have shown for roadways, and maybe coming up with a more uniform, like right-of-way width, stuff like that, that we can adopt as a region. I'm not sure if that's something everybody would be open to, but something like that.
Thanks. And I think, as far as the right-of-way widths, most of our communities have adopted them. I think maybe Springfield and Greene County have some slight variations on what, widths go with which classification. But at the same time, I think we would like to discuss more what is in between those right-of-way widths. And so maybe, the major thoroughfare plan, what I'm hearing from everyone, it's definitely the location of those roads and the classification of those roads is really important. But, we can also look at, are there updates to the specific standards in between that we could do to support the look of what each community wants as well. And something that's come up with the idea of street typologies, I know we had a little bit of discussion about that. It's probably been close to a year ago, but with, with the character of the street or places where we've talked about wanting to have changes, sorry, my phone's going off. So looking at where there might be an opportunity to, maybe even a first step kind of change, but we've talked about in Ozark, and I wish they were on this call, but we've talked about how that downtown section, while we have a classification that is, for a higher speed, primary arterial type of street, that does not maybe fit with their downtown. You're not going to have a Glenstone going right through downtown Ozark. And so, are there other ways that we can kind of look at those characteristics using the major thoroughfare plan?
Natasha, this is Frank again, and I know we use these widths and the design standards to help us when we're working with developers in the OTO area, and that's really helpful. But I also think I'm agreeing with, I think, what you're saying, that there sometimes is a context or a different setting for each of these. And if you look at the design standards, the boulevard is really a variant of a primary arterial that we needed we had a specific situation that needed something different with it. And then you mentioned the downtown example, which is another really good one, that maybe the road functions as a primary arterial, but it's never going to be able to have that width. And I know we have an exception process to kind of address those situations, but maybe the standards need another dimension to them that tries to anticipate some of that, because we have a lot of the secondary arterials out in the rural areas that those areas will probably always be rural, and maybe they don't need to have the same design that the standard design is. I definitely think it's worth taking a look at all that.
Okay, well, what I'm going to ask everyone to do before the next meeting, because I really do want to, dive into the application of each of our standards and see, how they, are there things that we want to adjust or change or combine, and have that conversation. Are there things that we maybe don't want the standards to address? But get into more of that detail. So please look through these, and then also look at the roads in your community and compare them regionally. And, does that classification match what that classification would be in another part of the region? And so maybe that's where we can start off some of that discussion as far as what the standards should look like. But I'm definitely hearing that everyone appreciates having the lines on the map and that level of classification so that we know what that plan is going forward.
Hey, Natasha, Dave wanted me to tell you that he got a comment on Facebook that he put in the chat box.
Oh, okay. Let's see. So the comment is that people in Springfield want more transit but have no idea how to use what we have. Not sure how to fix the communication gap. Free ride day doesn't help. I think as we're wrapping up our design standard discussion for today, Matt, do you want to address that comment?
Yeah, I can address that. That's something that we're constantly looking at and trying to fix for people. More technology, but what we've learned from our peer agencies is that people struggle to learn how to use transit and how to ride transit. As a matter of fact, when we go to transit conferences and other locations, everybody has to send really detailed instructions on how to use transit. So transit's not usually something that people outside of an area use. It's something that people inside of an area use, and it just takes time to learn how to use it. So something we struggle with daily, something we work on, making sure that what we have out there is cleaned up, information's good, and we'll continue to address that. But that's something that we struggle with, and as we find innovative ways, we'll work to deploy those. But it's just a daily struggle for us.
All right, well, thank you. And so hopefully that helps. Thanks for sharing that comment, Dave, and watching our Facebook. This meeting is being broadcast, so it's great to see some additional participation there. So now that we have a few more people on the call, I know a couple additional people were able to join us. I'd like to just real quick go back to this schedule. Were there any additional comments on the time, the start time? I know the afternoon time kind of ends up running into some TPC meetings and trying to stay on schedule and keep meeting regularly. And so the morning time, I think, works better if we keep to Wednesdays. But if there are no comments, then we'll just send out meeting notices. And so then everyone can, get that on their calendars, and we'll get through all the different parts of the plan. So then our next meeting is November 4th. And like I said, I want to focus on the design standards more specifically. And so we'll send out some information ahead of time on that as well. But I think that's all. If there's no other comments, we'll see everyone at 9:30 on November 4th. And I know it's hard to communicate over Zoom, but I really hope that we're able to find a way that we can, have some more discussion going forward. And if anyone has any suggestions on how we can do that, or if it comes down to just finding a really giant space we can all spread out in, we're looking for suggestions on that too. We want to make sure that this is a collaborative process. All right, well, thanks everyone, and have a good Wednesday.